Hi guys, welcome to week 3. We are diving into Linda Nochlin's article today, which is a lot of fun. We are going to talk about sort of her title and question, which sort of moves the article forward, which is, why have there been no great women artists? So Linda Nochlin wrote this article in 1971, and she's a pretty famous feminist scholar now, sort of part of um, the historic movement of feminism, the second wave of feminism, which we're going to talk about, and really bringing some of these ideas about women's place in the museum, whether that be an artist, or them as sort of the subject matter. We'll have the Guerrilla Girls coming into the picture in 1985, so very soon. But we have her writing this article in 71. Here she is on the right as well. There is also a really cool illustrated guide to Linda Nochlin's Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? It's kind of about Linda Nochlin as a scholar. This is her here. And so I will be having that link available to you so that you can take a look. But it's kind of this fun like breakthrough in how Linda Nochlin kind of gets to the place of writing this particular article. I just pulled it up here real quick so you can take a look because it's pretty fun. You have sort of the breakdown of who Linda Nochlin is, how she grew up, and then you can see her sort of move through the story here as her own little caricature in developing why she has these ideas about women artists and sort of where she gets the idea for this particular article. So what is happening historically during this period is really important. It helps us to think about why Linda Nochlin is writing this article and what's kind of coming about here. I'm going to give you sort of an idea of what's going on historically during this time period. So we're going to start with talking about sort of the second wave of feminism and why Linda Nochlin's article fits into that. So what is the context for how we're getting here? So in 1963, we have the publishing of The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. And this is a really monumental moment in feminist art history, in the second wave of feminism. And it is because it's of this monumental piece of work by Betty Friedan. A lot of scholars say that her work kind of spearheads the start of the second wave of feminism. So why did Betty Friedan write The Feminine Mystique? In 1957, Friedan asked to conduct a survey for her Smith College classmates at their 15th anniversary reunion. And she ends up trying to build this article based on these ideas. And what she actually finds is that a lot more women are unhappy with their lives than she thought. And so what ends up happening is she gets this book together and collects all of these ideas and information from these other women that she went to high school with and starts to realize sort of a trend in women's lives and then publishes this book about that. So what we see is when World War II comes around, so that's about from 1939 to 1945, we have women taking a big role in the world, right? In sort of manufacturing, in jobs, because men have gone overseas and they are fighting in World War II. You have women coming in and taking the positions that men were typically holding. And so you'll see in sort of these like Life magazine covers in 1942, as well as Rosie the Riveter, obviously, right? That we have women being brought into the conversations about manufacturing, about business, and really holding this powerful role in society that was previously held by men. Now, and whether or not you knew it, Rosie the Riveter was a real person. Her name was Naomi Parker, and she really existed. And women like this were participating in manufacturing and engineering and keeping these jobs and businesses afloat while men were in World War II. And then what happens when World War II ends is that men come back from the war, right? And they want their jobs back. And so the government, society, culture, advertising, how do we get women back in the home, right? Where they were before World War II, so that we can put men back in businesses, in the workplace, etc. And so we have the development actually of quote unquote suburbia in the 1950s. And so what this is that we have the GI Bill guaranteeing home loans, which helped to put people in houses faster. We have these suburban areas built by Levitt and Sons very, very quickly, where all the houses look the same, all the roads look the same. And so you have these massive suburban areas that did not exist before, right? The white picket fence, like these type of constructs that didn't exist before the 1950s. This is from Khan Academy. Built using the principles of assembly line mass production, Levittown went from a potato field to a community of 82,000 people in less than a decade. Construction proceeded according to 27 distinct steps, from pouring a concrete slab foundation, from pouring a concrete slab foundation to spray painting the drywall. Trees were planted every 28 feet. Every house in the division had exactly the same floor plan. Residents reported that at night they sometimes walked into the wrong house by accident. With all of these cost-saving measures, the earliest Levitt townhouses were only $7,000 or $29 per month for a mortgage, compared to the going rate of $90 per month for an apartment in the city. Now, as that's kind of crazy, right? You have your grandparents, for most of you, and probably great-grandparents, but my grandparents would have been alive in the 50s when this happened. And you have the baby boom coming in. Most of our parents are baby boomers. If you're kind of my age, I guess. Maybe not. But that's crazy, right? $29 a month for a mortgage is absolutely insane. But trying to put people in homes after World War II. And then what this means is that how do they put women back in the home, right? These women that have been taking these roles like Rosie the Riveter, how do we put them back in the homes to take care of the children and to make sure that the men, quote unquote, have this place to come home to, right? And so we have this system of advertising, of particular ideas and constructs that are forced upon women in the 1950s to remind them of their roles, to tell them they need to be in the homes, to show them what they should be focusing on, right? And so you have all of these pieces of advertisement or TV shows putting women back in the homes, reminding them what their place is, right? And you can see sort of during the time period, you know what the 1950s housewife is, right? That concept is not unfamiliar to you, hopefully. And of course, you see sort of the rise of sexist advertising as well, right? You have some really horrific images of the way that women are being treated and displayed. And we'll talk about this more at a different point. Here is another example as well of that. We also even have articles like this one that came out in Harper's Bazaar that said, "If you're a woman, don't vote." This article by Art Buchwald in July of 1960. In the pre-19th Amendment era, the American woman was placid, sheltered, and sure of her role in American society. She left all the political decisions to her husband, and he, in turn, left all the family decisions to her. Today, a woman has to make both the family and political decisions, and it's too much for her. Oh, it's so sad. You even have these crazy statistics. Average married woman was 20 when they got married, 14 million engaged by 17. College, 40% in 1920 to 35% of women in 1958. 60% dropping out of college once married. There's this idea of the degree of the PhD, which is putting husbands through. Women having more children, passing Indian birth rate, and 3 out of 10 women dyed their hair blonde. So we have all of these constructs really becoming part of who women are as we move into the 1950s and 1960s, that women are really taking on these roles that are being sort of passed upon them. And so what Betty Friedan discovers through her writing of the feminine mystique is that women are actually not content in the life that they have been leading. And so the feminine mystique, or sort of the idea that has been passed down from women to women in the 1950s, is that women are inherently content as oppressed mothers and housewives. And that, in fact, was not true. And people were sort of ignoring the fact. We have like psychologists and psychiatrists saying, oh, well, it's strange. A lot of women are kind of unhappy when they come to therapy, but like we don't know why. And so what Betty Friedan discovers in the quote unquote feminine mystique, right, is that women are actually not as happy as they appear to be on the exterior. This sort of performance of fakeness that they're living in is not reality. Oh, here's that quote from psychiatrists. So, housewife syndrome, women felt invisible with no personality, blaming recent dissatisfaction on the fight for women's rights, right? So, men were not thinking it was problem with them being cooped up at home, but instead that they had too much on their plate, like the Harper's Bazaar magazine stated. And then, strangely, a number of psychiatrists stated that in their experience, unmarried women patients were happier than married ones. I wonder why that could be. So this leads to the second wave of feminism in the 60s to the 80s. And then we have sort of the third wave start in the 90s. And what you see sort of in the second wave differing from the first wave is that we have the personal as political versus collective suffrage, turning inwards to redefine how they viewed themselves, the everyday, the domestic, and the specifically embodied, universalizing female voice in art, focusing around art and art history, not just politics, using the female body to embrace the female experience, so sexuality and vaginal imagery. You can think about Judy Chicago, Miriam Shapiro, and all those performance artists that we talked about, right? They're kind of right in the smack middle of this. So Yoko Ono, Carolee Schneemann, Marina Abramovich, using their body and their sexuality in a very particular way to embrace the female experience. We also have collaborative art making. So again, Judy Chicago, like the dinner party, and including more women in numerous classes, races, and sexualities. So the first wave of feminism was much more focused on white women and middle-class white women, versus the second wave starts to include more women as well. These are some great quotes by Lucy Lippard. She says feminist art in the 1970s is not a style or movement, but instead a value system, a revolutionary strategy, a way of life. Feminist artists about content versus the development of style, in which historically they have not been a part of. And so that sort of leads into our conversation about Linda Nochlin and how she's building sort of her argument in this article. This is another quote here as well, in which this is a great quote about what we're going to be discussing. So take a look and read it. Really kind of defines and thinks about how Linda Nochlin breaks down her argument as well. So this is kind of the outline of how I'm going to be breaking down this article. I think this helps. If you guys think it's terrible, let me know. So the first is to sort of break down the white male position accepted as natural, to then think about why have there been no great women artists and sort of the ways that this question is answered, the construct of the woman problem, institutional and educational setbacks, right, having to do with the Academy and the Royal Academy in France and otherwise. Break down the idea of Rosa Bond here, which is an artist that she invests a lot of time in, and then her historic conversations about female artists as a whole. So when we think art historically and kind of the way that most of you have probably learned about sort of the chronology, go away, of art history is that we typically discuss artists through a white male position accepted as natural. Hold on, I want to get this thing to go away. So what that typically means is that art historically through history, we're always talking about male artists, right? Who are the male artists that you remember? Even in like modernism especially, it's all males. We have Pollock, we have Monet, Manet, Seurat, all of these artists are almost always male. And you start to see women pop up here and there, but they're obviously not sort of half the population, right? And so this is a very typical, straightforward discourse that we probably have a good idea that this is happening, right? We're all kind of aware that women or anyone not white has really not been included in our historical dialogues. And so obviously in art history, scholars are now trying to work backwards and try to figure out how to sort of remedy that problem, which is difficult because you can't really break down a construct of the past that already existed and kept people down. So we do our best, I suppose. But the identification of art with wealth, with power and privilege of individuals who commissioned and purchased it, who were also males. So you have to not only think, yes, white artists and white male artists were encouraged, but also people who were purchasing that art were also male, typically white, etc. And so this becomes sort of the quote-unquote accepted viewpoint in history at large. And so this is what Nochlin states. In the field of art history, the white Western male viewpoint, unconsciously accepted as the viewpoint of art historian, may and does prove to be inadequate, not merely on moral and ethical grounds or because it is elitist, but on purely intellectual ones as well. So we may see the unstated domination of white male subjectivity as one of the series of intellectual distortions which must be corrected in order to achieve a more adequate and accurate view of historical situations. And again, I have the page numbers here at the bottom. If you guys notice these, this is the page number of the article that I'm referencing. So that brings us to the main question, right? Which is that why, if women really are equal to men, why have there never been any great women artists? And Nochlin talks about how this article has been asked of scholars, of art historians, right? If you really think that women are equal to men in the arts, why have there not been great women artists that have just appeared, right? That have situated themselves as masters in sort of the grand narrative, right? And so Nochlin talks about there's sort of three ways to answer this question, and she breaks them down about why they're problematic. So the first one is that women are incapable of greatness and genius. So this is sort of the answer, right, to why have there been no great women artists? Well, because women are incapable of greatness and genius. And this is something that will be espoused, right, by the Guerrilla Girls in 1985 with their work, with their ideas. This is a work from 1988, very satirical, right? The advantages of being a woman artist, which shows these sort of comedic advantages, right? So working without the pressure of success, not having to be in shows with men, being reassured that whatever kind of art you make, it will be labeled as feminism, seeing your ideas live on in the work of others, etc. And brings up one of the main ideas of Nochlin's article here, which is that not having to undergo the embarrassment of being called a genius. And this brings up sort of the construct and idea that have circled in art history for a very long time. Not to remind you that a lot of white males have written art history, so sorry to them. It brings up the cult of the genius, right? And superstar artists. So believing that there is something inherently biological about something that makes them a superstar, a genius in art. Here we have the mad Van Gogh spinning our sunflowers despite epileptic seizures and near starvation. Cézanne braving paternal rejection and public scorn in order to revolutionize painting. Gauguin throwing away respectability and financial security with a single existential gesture to pursue his calling in the tropics. Rough. Or Toulouse-Lautrec, dwarfed, crippled, and alcoholic, sacrificing his aristocratic birthrights in favor of the squalid and surroundings that provided him with inspiration. And so what this comes down to, right, is that believe that individual achievement happens first and talks nothing of influences or support from the society and institutions around him. So if Van Gogh and Cezanne and Toulouse-Lautrec can make it even when they've been downtrodden and suffered and been poor, then why can't women do it, right? And this supports the idea that women should be able to get artistic genius if they had it, because Van Gogh and others were able to get it, thus they don't have it at all. If women had the golden nugget of artistic genius, then it would reveal itself. This, of course, leaves out some of the major ideas, right? Which is that part of the idea that men can have continued making art is that they've had fathers who are also artists. So, for example, she gives quite a few of them here, but you have Pablo Picasso, who is supported by his father into becoming an artist, and having an artist father encourages you to become an artist because it's what your father is doing, and he trains you or apprentices you. You also have that system going on in the past as well, even sort of at the lower levels of just basic apprenticeship. So, for example, here at the top left, we have Ghirlandaio. He takes on Michelangelo as a student and sees how great he is, and then passes on his sort of training because Lorenzo de' Medici, who's very famous in Italy, part of this big family. People kind of talk about them like as the godfathers of the Renaissance or whatever, if you ever watch that documentary. But he takes on and supports the arts in Italy and sees Michelangelo as a great artist and kind of adopts him when he's a child. And so all of these constructs allow that while Michelangelo, yes, has talent, it is fed and encouraged by these numerous people with money and with information about how to produce in the arts and training. And so you have the production of these great artists out of apprenticeship and out of fathers as artists, etc. And a lot of art historians in the past, and even in the present to some extent, think about these artists as great people that just had the artistic gene, and it came out, and them being discovered by other people was just part of the way that they became amazing. It had nothing to do with their rise to fame, right, or whatever. And Linda Nochlin describes this as Hegeography, which is the writing of the lives of saints. So treating artists as though they're saints or above everybody else. I put halos on all of them for you. You're welcome. So that's really a big part of art history and historical dialogue. The second way that this question is attempted to be answered is through finding minor painters to fill in missing gaps. So this is an easy one, relatively straightforward, right? You find artists that produce great work that are female, and you say, well, what about this woman? What about this woman? And you do this by trying to say, well, you think this person is so great or that person is so great, like Monet. What about Mary Cassatt? What about her work? What about Bertha Morisset? And so sort of show them as an example. But those women had restrictions. They're not talked about as much in art history. We don't know a lot about them. So that still kind of fails to answer a lot of our questions, right? And the final one, which is that there's a different kind of greatness for women, a more quote-unquote feminine style. This, on the surface of it, seems reasonable enough. In general, women's experience and situation in society, and hence as artists, is different from men's, and certainly the art produced by a group of consciously united and purposefully articulate women intent on embodying forth a group of consciousness of feminine experience might indeed be stylistically identifiable as feminist, if not feminine, art. So Nochlin says, yes, okay, maybe that is true. Maybe women are connected sort of by different types of art and experiences. However, that has proven not to be true. What you find, in fact, is that women are more similar to other artists of their time period than they are inherently to other women of different time periods, right? So, of course, you are more connected to people in this living in the same time period of you as you, with the same sort of artistic ideas and focus. For example, Caravaggio with Judith beheading Holofernes. You have Artemisia Gentileschi coming up and creating a piece that's similar to his. And we'll talk about why they're not similar, in that Artemisia depicts things very differently than Caravaggio does. But she is a Caravaggisti, so is her father. They are focused on this tenebrism and use of light and color that Caravaggio has espoused in his own work, and thus Gentileschi is more connected to Caravaggio than she would be to, well, I don't know, Georgia O'Keeffe or someone random, right, from the modern art period. They're completely different moments in time, right? And so even though there's sort of this idea that women artists are more inward looking, more delicate and nuanced in their treatment of their medium, should all women art be connected through these feminine ideas or feminist, and that types of mediums are entirely female, right? I mean, that starts to feel like a bunch of nonsense. And this gets carried in art history quite frequently, that there's types of gendered art, which is that high art versus low art is separated by gender as well. So high art being painting, sculpture, architecture, all done by men, and the low arts like ceramics, textiles, and jewelry making, sewing, embroidery are done by women, right? And this carries through society. I mean, if you've never seen a man spending a whole lot of time cross-stitching or doing embroidery, it's probably part of this construct, right? This idea that types of art are specific to types of people, which is nonsense, right? It's bull. It doesn't matter what kind of art is quote unquote high art or low art. And these are luckily terms we don't even use anymore because they're nonsense, right? These are sort of historic ideas that a painting is better than a textile, or that architecture is better than ceramics, right? We can't define low art versus high art. It has no sort of power anymore in contemporary society, luckily. But this type of idea has kind of lingered. And so, and of course, the problem with doing this is that we don't ever define males specifically by their gender in art. We don't go, oh, well, this painting is so delicate because he's a man, right? And you do that with female art. When you study female art, there's this desire or need, or I don't know if it's like a societal construct. And even, like I can be problematic to that, or part of that necessarily, because it's sort of ingrained in you, right? To say that something is more feminine because it was produced by a woman, because you see that female's name there, and so you start to define that work by her gender, right? Which is nonsensical. And Nochlin gives the good example that Rococo art, which is oft produced by a lot of men. I think most of these are done by Watteau or Fragonard, who we're going to talk about again in this presentation. But we don't say that these works have to be frilly because men are frilly, right? They're not intrinsically connected, but we do this when it is a woman participating in painting, right? We start to define art as feminist or feminine because it was produced by a woman. And so what Nochlin gets to in trying to answer this question, right, is that it falsifies the nature of the issue at the same time that it insidiously supplies its own answer. There are no great women artists because women are incapable of greatness. So what it brings us down to, right, is that no matter how you answer this question, you always end up saying that in the end, women have not succeeded in being equal to men in the arts, and thus, by the definition of this question, are incapable of being great artists. And so, by attempting to answer it at all, they tactfully reinforce its negative implications. If women have in fact achieved the same status as men in the arts, then the status quo is fine as it is. But in actuality, as we all know, things as they are and as they have been in the arts, as in hundreds of other areas, are stultifying, oppressive, and discouraging to all those women among them who did not have the good fortune to be born white, preferably middle class, and above all, male. The fault lies not in our stars, our hormones, our menstrual cycles, or in our empty internal spaces, but in our institutions and our education. So, what it really comes down to, right, is that this is not because women are incapable of greatness, and it is not because women have not progressed in the arts as much as they want to, as much as they have, but that they had to fight for that right. And they are the women artists that have gained power, that have gained strength historically, are the exceptions to the rule, right? And it comes as a part of this women problem. And I noticed this time around when I read Nochlin, which is something I haven't noticed before actually, which is this idea of the quote unquote women problem, right? Versus the man problem, wealth problem versus poverty problem, which is that we call this a woman problem, right? That we want to be like, oh, well, that's their problem. Well, just as there are no equivalents to Michelangelo or Rembrandt, Delacroix, or Cezanne in females, there is no such Black American equivalence either. Thus, women and their situation in the arts, as in other realms of the endeavor, are not a problem to be viewed through the eyes of the dominant male power elite. And it starts to bring up kind of these other ideas, right? Like when people start scapegoating or using these quote unquote problems, right? Well, something that is a wealth problem might be a poverty problem for someone else, right? That is all about the viewpoint. So when someone says that there's a woman problem, that's coming from a male standpoint, right? And so when you think about school shootings as a mental health problem, or Black men being shot by the police as a bad apple problem, or Black people suffering from racism as an individual problem versus a systemic racist problem, riots and protests are an Antifa and a BLM problem, right? That you want to be able to blame somebody else. And when it comes to the people who are actually protesting, who are Black, who experienced school shootings, they would never call these things a problem like that, right? They would say a police problem, a brutality problem, a racist problem, right? So that's all in the eye of the beholder. So Linda Nochlin sets up sort of the institutional and educational setbacks that we see historically that have caused women to not be at the forefront of art and art history, right? And so what we have is that social institutions allow and forbid certain activities. So a big part of sort of the pulling back of women in the arts and their oppression in the arts has to do with women not being allowed to participate in the academy and in schooling, for example, in nude modeling. So women are not accepted as professional painters, and were not allowed to participate in the Royal Academy in France or in England to draw from the nude model, which was a big part of the training for artists at the time. They had to instead kind of quote unquote restrict themselves to minor fields of portraiture, genre, landscape, or still lifes. And you can see that in some of the examples that Nochlin gives. This is Johann Zoffany's painting of the Royal Academy that shows all of the current members of the Royal Academy. And however, they do have these two new models that are featured here. Oh, very scandalous, right? And the two members that are not featured are the two women who are hung on the wall here on the right. And you can see that some of them are kind of looking up to the paintings. And these two women were a part of the academy, but were not allowed to sketch from a nude male body, and thus were not allowed into the room even for the quote unquote membership painting, right? And so you have Angelica Kauffman and Mary Mosier, who are very famous women and famous painters, not even allowed to be featured in the painting of membership, right? They had to be paintings on the wall in a painting because they weren't even allowed to be seen in a painting men, right? So, which is nonsense. And it wasn't until 1922 that women were allowed back into the British Royal Academy, which is crazy. So women were always allowed to be objects or models, but never allowed to be members or in the same room as sort of other nude figures, right? For shame. So Nochlin gives you these examples of women having to draw other women fully clothed. So here's that with this drawing by Chattawiki. I cannot find a good image of it. This is the best that I can find. But here's an example of men drawing a naked man here. And even to the extent that in Thomas Eakins' life class at the Pennsylvania Academy around 1855, a cow instead of a nude man stands for their studies. So these women were allowed to sketch a cow, which is the same as a man. Whatever. And it really got me to thinking about some of the sort of modernist ideas that we have. So, for example, professors at the Bauhaus movement, when that started in Germany in 1928, that you have all of these male professors, and then we have this one female professor. And Gunther Stolz here was the director of tapestry making and of that program at the time in the Bauhaus workshop. She was the only woman in charge, and she ran this department for a long time. And Walter Gropius, who started the Bauhaus, initially did not have sort of a negative idea about women in the Bauhaus and in this, in running workshops. But there's a quote here that I have. Though initially women were given equal status at the Bauhaus, Gropius grew alarmed at the number of female applicants and restricted them primarily to weaving, a skill he deemed suitable for female students. And which is crazy, right? This is the 1920s, where women are very much gaining their more of a sexual freedom in the 1920s. Obviously not a lot, but a smidge. And yet famous women in the Bauhaus are restricted to weaving and being part of sort of the textile industry because of their sex, right? Annie Albers, who's famously married to Joseph Albers, who's another part of the Bauhaus, is restricted to tapestry work. And whether or not that influences how phenomenal of an artist she was or wasn't isn't sort of the point, right? It's that there continues to be a restriction on what white men deem is appropriate for women to create. So here Nochlin is describing a single aspect of automatic, institutionally maintained discrimination against women in such detail simply to demonstrate both the universality of this discrimination and its consequences, as well as the institutional rather than individual nature of but one facet of the necessary preparation for achieving mere proficiency, much less greatness, in the realm of art during a long period. So really, in outlining sort of this one idea, she tells us that here is one small facet of society that kept women from participating fully in art historical dialogues. And she can start to stretch it out into thinking, she mentions kind of these other ideas like marriage versus career, right? Sex or success versus marriage or a career. Men were able to give up marriage like Van Gogh, Delacroix, Degas, but they did not have to give up the pleasure of sex or companionship. If an artist in question happened to be a woman, 1,000 years of guilt, self-doubt, and objecthood would have been added to the undeniable difficulties of being an artist in the modern world. Always a model, but never an artist, might well have served as the motto of the seriously aspiring young women in the arts of the 19th century. There are even these constructs kind of about how women dabble in the arts, right? There's a husband saying, well, at least it keeps them out of trouble, right? That they can draw. You have books like The Family Monitor and Domestic Guide by Sarah Stickney Ellis, who's called Mrs. Ellis in the article, which really freaks me out for some reason, from 1848, who talks about what is appropriate for a woman and what isn't. To be able to do a great many things tolerably well is of infinitely more value to a woman than to be able to excel in any one. With many things will be a help. With one, will only dazzle for an hour, she says. Drawing is, of all other occupations, the one most calculated to keep the mind from brooding upon itself, and to maintain the general cheerfulness which is part of social and domestic duty. But it's also something that you could put down without greatly disturbing you, right? And so you can think about how this book and these constructs are preparing women to be married and to not sort of encourage them to be in a career, right? They have to support their husband. And so they can do it for leisure, but not for a career. And you can think about anybody who went against these odds at the time. I thought immediately of Jane Austen because she's someone who's familiar to me, who's sort of not willing to marry because didn't want to be dependent on a husband. And you had her sister who had lost her fiance and also did not marry, and so she supported them financially with her books, which she would not have been able to do if she was married, and probably had to give up possibly her career as well as her identity. And so, as Nochlin states, this is only really the tip of the iceberg, right? Women must be willing to look the facts of their situation full in the face without self-pity or cop-outs. At the same time, they must view their situation with a high degree of emotional and intellectual commitment necessary to create a world in which equal achievement will be not only made possible, but actively encouraged by social institutions. So, even this small idea, this small construct of social institutions not supporting them and marriage and men in general, this is only a very small part of women and artists who are not white being left out of art historical dialogues, right? She could write an entire book about all the problems that face us in society as women or as non-white individuals. And she also gives this painting as an example, Emily Mary Osborne's Nameless and Friendless, of a woman trying to sell her paintings to whoever he may be, an art owner or gallery owner or museum owner. And she's nameless and friendless. Apparently she has a tear running down her cheek, etc., right? This sort of contract that's been built around women and what happens if they give up their life to be an artist. And here's another quote by Nochlin about that topic as well. So Nochlin mentions sort of a, oh my God, it's raining again. Good God. A artist who sort of escapes these constructs and able sort of to make a name for herself. To some extent, which is Rosa Bond here. And you may have heard of her before if you studied modern art before. She was a very famous female painter at this time in the 1800s, mid-1800s. And her father was a drawing master, and he did encourage her to work. He does abandon his family for a while to join a group called the St. Simeons, who believe in some kind of female messiah or something. Nochlin like briefs it, and I'm like, I don't, it's some sort of extensively strange, he kind of joins this like weird religious group for a short amount of time. And when his wife dies of tuberculosis, he has to come back and raise his children. Now, whether or not he was sort of a great influence on Bonnie here is hard to know. She did stay at home and live with him. But he was an artist, and thus she did become an artist as well. So that seems to have some connection, theoretically. She did also have a great family. This is her siblings, and I believe like her, one of them is like either her father or brother-in-law or sister-in-law. But her family did encourage her in her art as well. Beyond just her father. But she is able to create these really masterful pieces of sort of livestock images that were really popular at the time in the 1850s. She was able to sort of capture the individuality, even the soul of each of the animal subjects that kind of coincided with bourgeoisie taste at the time, and thus she becomes kind of famous in her own right at the time, and is able to become a very popular artist that people really want to buy. However, she was starting to receive some harassment in public for painting as a woman, and thus she does receive permission from the police to dress like a man. And she said it was always because of her profession. So, for example, in the horse fair, she had to go and go to these like horse markets and view these events to be able to paint something like the horse fair. And so she had to dress in men's clothing because otherwise it distracted from her work. And so she was given permission to dress in pants by the police at the time. She was only one in about 12 women who were allowed to wear trousers in the 1850s, which is pretty crazy. Here are some of her sketches from the horse fair as well. So she was able to wear pants to kind of disguise herself as a man and not bring attention to her gender, so that she was able to take these drawings as a woman and a female artist. She also did not marry and had a platonic union, I believe, which Nochlin states, with her fellow woman artist Nathalie Micus, who evidently provided her with the companionship and emotional warmth which she needed. And if you have any intuition about it like I do, and it seems to be carried out with other people, was that Rosa Bond here was probably gay. It seems that her and Micus had a sexual relationship. It was never talked about in the 1850s, obviously, because that would not have been something that would have been accepted. And so there seems to be the idea that it is likely that Bonnet here was gay, and Micus and her were romantic partners, in fact. And this kind of carries out through art history, and I don't think Nochlin really even steps on it, right? Saying platonic union, right? Which is most likely not true. I discovered as of recently that Rosa Bonnie here had a doll that was made after her here on the left, which was located at the Worthington Historical Society Doll Museum now today. But because she was so popular, they made a doll of her that little girls could play with, which eventually leads, maybe creepily, to her second wife. So Micus dies, and this woman, Anna Klumpke, who is on the left and painted this image of Rosa Bond here on the right, played with this doll as a child, and they actually fall in love and get married, quote unquote, possibly, as the rumors go. And so they live together for an amount of time. And so here is Rosa Bonnet here and Anna Klumpke 1 year before Bonnet here died in 99. It seems to be kind of acknowledged now that they were all in fact sort of queer women and queer women painters because of this sort of dialogue between these three women and what had occurred, and the fact that Bonnet here didn't ever marry anybody, didn't want to quote unquote give away her sort of sexual freedom, believing that it would sacrifice her independence. I don't know why I just talk like that. Too many young girls let themselves be led to the altar like lambs to the sacrifice, she maintained, which is pretty dark. But all three of them are buried together, Micus, Bonnet here, and Klumpke. So there's very much the sense that Bonnet here didn't do these things because she was gay. But regardless, Bonnet here is able to gain this sort of fame and power by not engaging in the social institutions that existed at the time. Nochlin does kind of cite this really strange moment where Bonnet here is being interviewed and talked to about her accolades, and someone asks her about her wearing pants. And she kind of defends herself, saying, oh, well, she's still feminine. She can put on a skirt right now. It makes you uncomfortable. And Nochlin states that this world-renowned artist should feel compelled late in life to justify and qualify her perfectly reasonable assumption of masculine ways for any reason whatsoever, and to feel compelled to attack her less modest trouser-wearing sisters at the same time. Sort of saying that women who wear pants for social reasons are sort of silly, in order to satisfy the demands of her own conscience and perpetually, right, the people who supported her and bought her paintings, that she had to continue to lie, um, or not even lie, but defend how feminine she was, right? So that people wouldn't think that she was trying to be this sort of ludicrous gay woman, right? Wearing pants and painting livestock or whatever, right? She had to defend her femininity because otherwise she would not have been accepted into the artistic community. And that's insane, right? She even says how her partner, Natalie, laughs at how silly the skirts are, right? To be walking around and whatever, or how silly the pants are, that is. But this is all part of this dialogue, right? That she has to keep up these ideas. Otherwise, she's going to be rejected by this artistic community that has shockingly supported her, right? And made her famous. And so while she's this famous artist, and Nochlin describes her as this great example of a woman who thwarted social institutions, she's still very much part of this oppression on women, bringing them down, reminding them that they still have to be feminine or be one way or another, right?